Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. When Russia launched a full-on invasion of Ukraine in late February, many people expected Moscow to undertake heavy cyber and information attacks as well as kinetic military action. More than 2 months into the war, Kyiv has not only managed to keep the country online despite a number of hacking attempts by Russia, but it has actually gone on the offensive. I'm joined today by 2 Berlin-based cybersecurity experts to talk about cyber attacks, targeted disinformation campaigns, and the threat of massive disruption as tools for modern warfare and how this is playing out in the current conflict. With me today are Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar. She is the director of the Digital Society Institute at the European School of Management and Technology in Berlin, and previously she served as the ambassador for cyber diplomacy and director general for the cyber diplomacy department in the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Heli, welcome to today's conversation.
Hello.
And also with us from Berlin is Tyson. He's the head of the Technology and Global Affairs program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik. Tyson, it is so good to see you again, and I want to thank you for joining us as well.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, and what we thought we would do today is have you, Heli, maybe set the stage for us with some opening comments, and then we'll pick up on some of the points that you make and go into our conversation.
First of all, thank you for having us here and to have this conversation, which is very timely on the cyber elements of the ongoing war of aggression by Russia and Ukraine. So many observers have been wondering why we haven't seen major cyber elements visibly happening on the ground. It is a bit like, it depends whom you ask, whether they have seen or have not seen elements of cyber. Because we know that there have been attempts actually to disrupt the Ukrainian infrastructures. Before the war, there was an attempt to derail the train system, for instance, but there was also a very good, excellent cooperation between different private sector and public sector entities across the Western and Ukrainian cyber community, which also has been the reason why we have not seen so many attacks in Ukraine. Many of those attacks or attempted attacks have been mitigated, and some of the attacks which had been successful then had a very quick response. There was an attack against the telecom infrastructure and energy infrastructure, but the Ukrainian cyber defense, of course, also has become so much better since the 2014 invasion. And Ukrainians have learned from 2015 and 2016, after they had been attacked and they lost electricity for a long time in some of the cities. So the effort that has gone into Ukrainian cyber defense certainly is also the reason why we do not see so many attacks. There is also the other element, which is the strategy and how cyber fits to the Russian overall strategy in Ukraine right now. The overall strategy is to go and invade. And you actually, in order to capture the territory, you have to invade by boots and by tanks. You cannot do it with just hacking. And this is explaining why the military activities are prioritized. And the high-tech element in this war has been actually quite, I'm not saying missing, but not such significant as one would have expected actually in modern war. Also, there is an element that Russians cannot terrorize Ukrainian population with cyber attacks. What they can do with the carpet bombing, with the siege of Mariupol or other cities, or all these brutal acts against civilians that we have learned about. And this is strategy. This is not just happening because it was a war. This is deliberate Russian strategy. Let's not mistake there. Let's not make a mistake thinking that it just kind of happened itself. So, and the third element, I think why we haven't seen it so much is that it's quite difficult to coordinate between actually the military advance, which in Russian case would be under the military command structures, and the cyber operations, which in their case would be under intelligence agencies, command structures. Even military itself cannot coordinate very well in Ukraine right now. They can't coordinate between the army and the air force. They cannot coordinate between different land battalions. So the logistics is nightmare for Russians. The tanks have run out of the fuel in first days. We know all these stories. So if you add to this complexity cyber attacks at the right time, at right point, that's too difficult for the Russians, unfortunately, or fortunately for us. So yeah.
So that's a great way to start, because actually, my first question had been sort of why cyber as a tool of warfare seems to be playing a secondary role in this conflict when so many people had thought it would play a much more dominant role as a tool to create massive disruptions in Ukraine. And so I guess, first question to you, Tyson, after what Heli had to say is whether your assessment is any different and whether you have anything to add. But as a footnote to that, one of the things that I've been seeing is that some people think that maybe Moscow's capacity or capability is not as expansive as some have assumed or assessed it to be. But from what Heli's saying, it sounds like it really is a deliberate non-use of cyber operations in this regard, because the kinetic operations are being put front and center.
I thank you for the invitation, and I think that it's both, and everything that Heli said is accurate. And maybe I can just add a couple of points. One is Heli, as a student of Russian cyber doctrine, has educated me and others about the idea of a kind of continuum of conflict, from low intensity to high intensity conflict. And when you look at what Russia is doing in its invasion and war, all-out kinetic war on Ukraine, it's much easier, cheaper, and more effective to bomb infrastructure than it is necessarily to use fancy zero-day attacks that reveal, capabilities, that reveal information, reveal secrets that you have into others' infrastructure that you might want to save for some other kind of situation. So in a high-intensity conflict, which is exactly what's happening in Ukraine, it's a war, kinetic cyber attacks aren't necessarily the most effective way to execute your objective. Now, the other thing is, of course, that we have seen that intelligence estimates on Russia's military capabilities have been overestimated. And I think that in some ways we're seeing something similar. This is not a moment for complacency, but something similar with regard to its cyber capabilities, because the balance of capacity has tilted much more in favor of the Ukrainians since 2013, 2014, or since the Georgia War in 2008, et cetera. That Ukraine itself has evolved, has learned, has built connective tissue with allies and partners in the West, in Europe, and the United States. And that has helped too, and continues to help. So if you look at, for example, intelligence penetration that the United States is providing, which enabled the attack on this Russian warship, Moskva. If you look at cyber capacity building support that the European Union has provided through PESCO, for example, which is, of course, not as robust as the US ISR support. But if you look at what they have tried to do under the kind of Lithuanian flag, they have a lot of top cover coming from allies and partners. And that's another aspect that I think is important to talk about when you look at cyber in Ukraine and Russia, is Russia doesn't have any top cover. It doesn't have any allies to rely on, quite the opposite. In fact, if you think about IT specialists, They are a very finite resource in all countries. And for Russia, right now, they are strained to capacity. So not only are they dealing with a situation where Mikhail Fedorov, the deputy prime minister and digital minister of Ukraine, is calling an IT army to support Ukraine with crowdsourced operations on Russia, and being quite effective. They are in a defensive posture with their limited resources, their limited cyber and IT specialists. Those limited cyber and IT specialists, it has to be said, are also dealing with a degrading kit, both in hardware and software, because of the sanctions that have been placed on them, because of the withdrawal of a lot of the enabling infrastructure that has been in place in Russia. All these companies leaving the country, the lack of access to semiconductors, just constraints across the board in technological infrastructure. And the final point I would make on this is, of course, Russia's IT specialists are leaving the country. In the past month, there have been between 50 and 70,000 IT specialists that have left Russia for the West. The expectation of Russia's IT association is another 100,000 will leave. That's 10% of the entire IT workforce of the Russian economy. So that is not only a constrained capacity, but it's one that's shrinking. So there are a lot of reasons, but those, I think, just complement what Heli has already said.
Yeah. No, I mean, I in our conversation so far, we've really been focusing on Ukraine and on how this is playing out in Ukraine. And I certainly want to come back to that. But for the moment, I'd like to widen the aperture a little bit and pick up on something that you mentioned, Tyson. And Heli, I think that this is something that you've also given a lot of thought to. Obviously, as we all know, the West is imposing crushing sanctions on Russia. And you talked a little bit about this, Tyson, the kind of tech sanctions that we're seeing, how Russia's being starved of semiconductors. And Putin has definitely sort of seen these sanctions as a form of non-kinetic warfare. And so the question that I have, and this is a question that Europeans and Americans share alike, of how the conflict in Ukraine might spread more broadly. And so the core question, I think, in this regard is whether either of you anticipate sort of a more aggressive, persistent, low-intensity response in cyberspace to countries in the West as a retaliation for the sanctions that are being imposed by Europe and the United States. I don't know who wants to sort of take a first shot at that.
I can start. I don't think that the sanctions so far have initiated this kind of response. But what we have seen was that Sweden and NATO talking about Sweden and Finland talking about NATO membership. This has actually been noticed, and Finnish governmental institutions experienced a distributed denial of service attack a couple of weeks ago, and so I think we could see, because interestingly, sanctions are seen as evil, yes, but not evil that strikes the core. It's our Western thinking that economy is important. Well, if you study Russian history, then you understand that well-being of citizens has never been an important factor for the elites. But what is important is the further NATO enlargement, because NATO enlargement is seen as some sort of another failure. And I'm sure that around this next few weeks, when we see more and more Swedish and Finnish statements on NATO membership, and once they have that kind of NATO candidate member status, we might see then certain aggressive hybrid attacks, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns against them, I feel.
Interesting. So you think it's not something that will happen sort of in the current context, but it is something that could happen related to NATO enlargement, that could be sort of the catalyst.
I think it's higher probability.
Yeah. Yeah. Tyson.
Can I just say, add to that? I think that Heli is completely right to say that NATO enlargement is an unintended byproduct of Russia's war on Ukraine, and definitely one that will cause a lot of hurt feelings in Moscow. They have already, the Kremlin has already initiated cyber attacks on Finland, in addition to incursions into Finnish airspace as a kind of shot across the bow. But of course, the impact of those attacks is just to harden public opinion in the direction of joining NATO. So I don't know if it might feel good for those elites, but I don't know if it's going to get the kind of intended outcome that they want. Mm-hmm. There have already been some, and this is something that people in Germany and elsewhere have been concerned about. There have been second order impacts of attacks on Ukraine already, including the attack on the satellite network in Ukraine, which led to the disruption of operations of around almost 6,000 wind turbines in Germany. So the unintended consequences are also there. I think that is something that the Germans are particularly aware of. But as far as next phases, I do think that Putin and those around him think that the United States in particular, NATO and the EU to some extent are parties to this conflict. And they're not going to declare kinetic, well, it's unlikely that they would do kind of kinetic action against NATO. But I think that cyber would be the tool that they would reach for, because clearly they don't have the symmetry to have real impact through sanctions. So as far as the interdependence weapons that they have at their disposal, the internet connectivity is the only one they've got.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've both touched on this, and I mean, I think all of our viewers know this, that over the past decade or so, Russia has definitely utilized cyber operations to create disruption in the West, Estonia being at the top of the list, but of course also cyber attacks against the Bundestag, against Congress. I mean, in elections, we've really seen it all over the place. And you both recently co-authored a piece on sort of the evolution of the cyber threat landscape and how Russia's cyber campaign has evolved as well. And in that piece, you talk about the gray zone conflict in cyberspace. And I was wondering, first, if you could define what that gray zone conflict is, sort of what that space is where you see the potential for cyber attacks, or a cyber Achilles heel, if you will, but then also what the West can do to prepare against those kinds of attacks.
Heli, do you want to start? I've got a couple of points, but you go ahead.
Well, let's start with you this time.
Okay. I wasn't going to take on the definition. I was going to take on how. Well, I'll take on one element of the definition. It's playing with the tripwire of proportionate reaction. So it's anything below it's below threshold conflict that does not elicit anything proportionate as a reaction that the Russians have been very adept at doing in past decades. Just needling, acting as a spoiler, causing mischief, but always maintaining the calculation on the part of democracies that they don't want to escalate conflict. So if you look at some of the incidents that we're all aware of, the 2016 hack, meddling in elections, disinformation campaigns, all that kind of stuff, the reactions in the past, the Bundestag hack, the reactions have tended to be late and disproportionate to the damage that has been done. So that creates an incentive structure for Russia to continue and iteratively, increase that, just slightly increase the escalation of that kind of gray zone conflict. But Russia doesn't want to get the proportional blowback from their actions. And that's why it hasn't been something like, I think that the Russians themselves were very surprised, for example, and not happy with the Colonial Pipeline incident, because that grazed too closely on conventional conflict. But ransomware attacks, even the ransomware attacks in 2017 against Ukraine, which kind of ricocheted throughout the global economy, caused them to try to put in tripwires, to put in safety guardrails to make sure that you wouldn't have that kind of cascade ransomware impact. So that's kind of how I would define it: below threshold, not eliciting, keeping the escalatory caution in place in the West, and making sure that consequences are not proportionate.
Yeah, I would agree with Tyson that they had calculated for very slow response on the Western side, which was true. In 2017, after NotPetya, for instance, it took a long time before there was some sort of statement by the Western countries, and then it took a very long time until the EU could put together its sanctions regime. But interestingly, still, these events worked like a catalyst. And because of NotPetya, because of these cumulative events, EU now is there. It has its sanctions regime to punish the entities in different countries for cyber attacks. So, and I think what we have seen is also the very clear calculation that the gray zone also ends somewhere. So it's not, sometimes people call it 4.7, not Article 5, not Article 4, but Article 4.7 when we are in our cyber conflict. So, and Russians know quite well where it ends, so they avoid going to the threshold of international humanitarian law armed conflict, which is defined by some legal measures, some economic impact, loss of lives and so on. But they are operating in this gray zone, knowing, yes, but it's bad, it's painful, but it's not so drastic so that the West will be drastically changing its course of action and come together. And they have got away with many of the quite disruptive attacks so far. But I think now with Ukraine, of course, the surprise was big how united West suddenly was, because this was the last drop. But with cyber operations, with information warfare, with hybrid operations, I think also our Western response has been slow because we are not very well prepared for responding. Our governmental agencies are not on the same continuum on these issues. Like no one is in charge of the content control or information warfare in the West. So we are talking about cyber, which is more technical, whereas the Russians talk about information, which is content. So we are not like even understanding the same language what they are talking. So I think there is certainly room for development for our own response, how to act in this gray zone.
I'd like to come back to the information side of it a little bit later, but because I do think it's important. But I think it was you, Heli, who mentioned that Mikhailo Fedorov, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Digital Issues in Ukraine, had said, this is something that Ukraine has basically been preparing for since 2014. And so there's been kind of an awareness that these are not isolated incidents, but part of an overarching campaign. Certainly at the Munich Security Conference this year, there was a lot of hand-wringing about what the West's proportional response should be to whatever action Russia might take. And I had the opportunity to speak with a Ukrainian who said, you in the West are very naive if you think about what Russia has been doing since 2014. You've seen each of these things as an isolated incident and not as part of an overarching campaign that needs to be addressed. And I think that sort of feeds into what you're saying, Heli, about the West not really being ready to respond. Do you think that there's now a greater awareness in Europe and even in the United States about the fact that this is part of a larger campaign rather than just a series of isolated incidents?
I hope. I hope that the policymakers have seen that this is a clear pattern, and Russian aggressiveness has been growing in years, and it is a cumulative kind of activity, not just the same intensity activity. So, but I think we also in the West, we also have lost this geopolitical thinking because of the Cold War ended without shots fired. And this complacency where especially maybe some of our European nations have fallen, I hope has now ended. And we know this debate in NATO, how the European countries are not able to pay or don't want to pay or do not prioritize defense, and how the US troops and US deterrence still works in Europe, and the US unwillingness to continue paying for European security. So that's the usual NATO inside debate. So, and it's all over the papers. I don't reveal any secrets here. I think this is now a bit changing. I would hope that there is the sense in Europe now that yes, history is back. History has not ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. So.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one point to what Heli said? And she mentioned, cumulative response, and that there has been a learning process also in the West. And thinking about Europe, you see the European cyber diplomacy toolbox, which Heli worked on, which has certain consequences. It has not been as fast moving as the Russian, ratcheting up of aggression. But if you look at, for example, and just to give you an example, the Bundestag hack in 2015, it took until 2020 for the attribution of that hack to take place. And the consequence was sanctioning of 2 individuals at the GRU in response. That is EU sanctions, of course, that's good, but it wasn't a kind of, nobody would question whether hacking and stealing sensitive data on elected officials just warrants 2 sanctions 5 years later. I will say, though, that the attribution diplomacy piece has gotten a lot quicker. It's compressed a great deal in recent, and even before this war. So, for example, Ghostwriter, another hacking operation the Russians engaged in Poland and in Germany prior to the 2021 elections, was attributed by the EU almost in real time. And that demonstrates that, at least on the attribution side, that things are getting a lot better, a lot more compressed.
Thank you. I think that's a very important insight. But I'd like to maybe switch gears just a little bit, because there are a couple of very important meetings that are coming up. The G7 Digital Ministerial is coming up. The Technology and Trade Council the US-EU Technology and Trade Council will be meeting in France. To what degree do you think the sort of cyber and tech side of the conflict in Ukraine will factor into some of those conversations and discussions?
It will be central. Maybe I can just start with a couple of things. One on the G7 Digital Ministerial, which is supposed to take place next week in Düsseldorf. I'll be honest. This government is new. Technology and digitization are secondary priorities for the G7 presidency, I think it's fair to say. That said, it has been impacted by Russia's war on Ukraine. They invited Minister Fedorov to attend. They're anticipating to release a statement on cybersecurity and cyber capacity building, both within the G7 space and in third countries. So there is that aspect is included. They've got some other issues that are more economic, that are not related to this war, but that's there. On the TTC side, it's very central. when the three ministers from the United States, Blinken, Raimondo, and Tai, meet in 2 weeks with Dombrovskis and Vestager in Paris, one of the things you will see is a codification of the excellent cooperation that the two sides have had on dual-use export controls, specifically the implementation of something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which just strangled Russian access to IP, technology, and software in foundational technologies like semiconductors. Prior to that, this tool had only been used against companies like SMIC, the semiconductor company in China, or Huawei. In this war, they used it against the entire country of Russia. And because of the TTC, they had the muscle memory, the structures in place to negotiate pragmatic carve-outs in very, very discrete areas that might be necessary, while avoiding blowback and secondary sanctions that could have just ruptured the European tech industrial base. So everybody sees this as quite a successful exercise. That said, one of the big concerns coming into the TTC is the disinformation war that has taken place. And I think that everybody realizes, and Heli and I have written about this, that, President Zelensky, at least in the global north, is seen as kind of the great influencer of the moment. He is somebody who has been a great communicator. The flow of information, of open source intelligence out of Ukraine, out of Bucha, out of Kherson, out of all these places has been really effective. But that has not been the case in the global south, where different narratives have started to metastasize, both pushed by by Russia, and given top cover by China, which, although it has been in compliance with technology and other sanctions, has been active in promoting disinformation narratives in the global south, in Africa, in South America, et cetera, in India. So I think that there's going to be a lot of talk about what war propaganda is, what the tools of platform governance can be, because of course we want to preserve an open, free speech environment online. But what we've seen in this conflict in particular has been, let's say, selective application of laws. Just to give you an example, or of policies. The decision to deplatform essentially RT and Sputnik in Europe was a political decision. It was not necessarily based on legal grounds. If you compare it with something that happened in the United States, it's somewhat similar to what happened with the deplatforming following January 6th. They dug up reasons, but the outcome was a political outcome that they had already decided based on events. It wasn't based in law or, regulation or the structures that were already in place. So I think there's going to be a lot of thinking about how do you govern that other gray space, which is platform and information ecosystems.
Well, just to add, we have Digital Services Act, which is trying to cover the platforms activities, at least in Europe. But let's not go there, because we should have another meeting for Digital Services Act and Digital Market Act. I wanted to maybe mention that there are many other transatlantic links which are maybe not in the news. And this is on the cyber deterrence side. It has been in the news as well, but not always picked up in larger public. So we actually have the cooperation framework on cyber stability between the US and most of the technologically advanced European countries, as well as Japan and Australia. And then we have done joint statements in the United Nations and so on, where we seek to set up cyber stability regime, which also is based on the information sharing and the joint deterrence activities, including the statements on attributing the different cyber attacks to certain countries. So we have done many attribution acts or statements since 2018 on Russia, China, and some others, and we know it's not maybe very effective, but maybe it is still effective for certain players, because although we know that the GRU officers will not be deterred if they land on the EU non-entry list, but maybe the third parties who would help them will not help them next time, because they are suddenly finding themselves on this EU non-entry list. So somehow the sanctions have a longer term effect when we talk about cyber sanctions. And the second maybe interesting kind of ad hoc coalition that has now emerged is about Ukraine. So we have a very huge Western solidarity between the private sector, between the governments, like between all white forces versus dark forces. So we are somehow interestingly finding ourselves that the line is quite clear between the democratic countries' stakeholders, not just governments, all the stakeholders, and then the authoritarian dark forces. And the majority of the stakeholders in our Western countries are doing the utmost in the cyber field to help Ukraine right now, which is sometimes organized, but sometimes also very voluntary. And in cyberspace, it's also difficult to check and measure who did what exactly, which is how we only can talk about it theoretically.
I'd like to stick with this global dimension for just a minute. As Tyson knows, we had the opportunity to host State Secretary Jörg Kukies yesterday. He's the Chancellor's G7, G20 Sherpa. We were talking about Germany's priorities during its presidency of the G7. And one of the things that we talked a little bit about was sort of the broader sort of multilateral implications and how things that the G7 agrees to can be brought to a broader community. Tyson, you were talking a little bit about some of the tensions between the global North and the global South, and Heli, you were talking a little bit about some of these alliances that we're seeing of sort of Western unity, strong Western unity along democratic lines. And so, part of me wonders how these issues can spread in East Asia, Latin America, and the global South, and what sort of divisions we're seeing, because we're certainly seeing a lot of countries that are sort of on the fence in terms of their stance on the war in Ukraine. They are not taking a position because they don't want to sort of hurt either side, their chances with either side, and ultimately that hurts them as well. But they're not taking a stand. So in this sort of digital tech cyber dimension, how do each of you see this playing out on a global scale?
So if you don't mind, I'll start with a little anecdote, which is, on April 28th, the White House, the Biden White House, issued something called the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which was essentially a document that talked about pluralism, openness, the wholeness of the internet, that we don't want to go in the direction of segmentation of the internet, that we want to keep it the governance of the internet multi-stakeholder based, that we want private sector and civil society participation in all aspects, that we want to protect the rights of minorities, avoid censorship, all those kind of things, and persecution, surveillance. It was an outgrowth of President Biden's Summit for Democracy approach, let's say, and it is part of that arc. So the White House held a Zoom call for a signing. It was very meaningful in many ways. They got 60 countries to sign up. In fact, if you looked at the Zoom, you could see Minister Fedorov there and Audrey Tang from Taiwan. So the subtext was definitely present that, this is a statement of values, a statement of digital values, and it's something that we want to enforce and promote in the same way that we have the Universal Charter on human rights. We want to have this kind of idea of the internet that's universal. Here's the problem. Of the countries, the 60 countries that signed, a lot of the systemically important tech powers from the global south were not present. So India didn't sign, Brazil didn't sign, South Africa didn't sign, even, and this is surprising, South Korea and Mexico didn't sign.
Wow.
And Kenya, which signed, rescinded its signature. So what is clear is that we have a lot of work to do in making sure that the global south, not just national governments, but civil society, subnational governments, private sectors, other institutions like churches feel like they have an equal stake in this vision of the digital space, this common vision. And one of the aspects that the TTC wants to promote in this lane is how we can enable them through connectivity infrastructure. How can we promote our values through the spread of inclusive connectivity infrastructure that doesn't create lock-in effects, that doesn't create digital mercantilism? And I think that there's going to be a push in Paris for ICT financing principles that both the Global Gateway, which is the EU's big development financing mechanism for connectivity infrastructure, and Build Back Better World can support. And that's also something that came out of the UK's G7 last year. So that's a place to start. But the truth is that part of it is just us showing up. We have to engage them as equal stakeholders at all levels. I sit here in Germany, and one of the debates we talk a lot about here in Germany is digital sovereignty. But people have different views on what digital sovereignty is and if it's good or bad. But one thing you have to appreciate for the Germans is it's sovereignty that works on multiple dimensions. It's not just a narrow, Westphalian idea of sovereignty. Individuals are sovereign. Companies are sovereign. Institutions are sovereign. Subnational governments are sovereign. And it's really about the freedom to choose. And this is written into the German government coalition. They want to promote the idea of digital sovereignty in the global south. And this is a thing that we need to do more of, because only then will we get them to the table and get them to be on our side.
Heli, would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, I had an honor to sit in the UN rooms for the past 3.5 years with all 193 countries in the world. So before Corona, we were physically in New York or Geneva all the time because we had those two global working groups, Open-Ended Working Group and GG. And when pandemic hit, we were moving to internet. And so we were having all these conversations with all UN members on cyber stability, on international law, on norms. And I would echo what Tyson said, that the Global South is not always very convinced that they somehow, they do not see benefit of aligning with either side. There is a Western camp, and there is the more authoritarian camp, and there are many countries in between. In the UN speak, we call them non-aligned or G77 nations that used to be non-aligned countries during the Cold War. And now, after the actual kinetic war initiated by Russia, many of those non-aligned countries are even more puzzled and even more at loss, because during the Cold War, they somehow avoided choosing the part or choosing the side. And then now they feel the moral obligation to do it, but at the same time, they also know that it's better not to stick their head out too much in the global politics, because you might be hit by both sides. And also there is some sort of resentment recently growing towards the West, especially in the technology issues. And this played also out in our cyber discussions sometimes. And whenever we talked about attribution, for instance, in the UN, then many African countries were saying, like, we do not have the capacity to help ourselves. And we are afraid of writing very strong sentences here in the UN report on attribution, because if somebody uses our territory to attack you, does it mean that you will start war against us? So they had like genuine concerns there about their own very limited capacity to deal with threats coming from digitalization and increasing use of technology, and we can understand it. And I think that's why the technologically advanced part of the world has certainly the obligation to also provide assistance and provide capacity building to less advanced countries in this field.
But Heli, let me push you on that for just a second, because I wonder what forum or format might be suitable for trying to bridge the gaps that you and Tyson are describing.
I don't think we have to pick one format. We have many formats already. I mean, there are, I don't say thousands, but hundreds of the United Nations working groups on these issues. We have IGF, Internet Governance Forum. Yeah. We have the whole playad of different committees under the different UN sub-agencies, like starting with ITU, which is of course very famous, and we know that there are disputes right now who is going to be the next head of the ITU, because it is now kind of sliding under the authoritarian nation's control. And there are also many other formats already on specific digital and cyber capacity building set up globally. They are usually multi-stakeholder formats, which means that it's not like, it doesn't always have to be the UN or government, because we know that majority of the technology is produced not by any government, but by the private sector, and majority of infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So, but what possibly, of course, we have to do is to become more efficient in terms of using our collective Western capacity to help the less advanced part of the world. Because when I can see the choice in some of the African countries, if there is a nice visit from Europe with the promise to set up maybe the cable infrastructure in next 20 years, but some other friends are offering the 5G equipment right now. So they are presented with these kind of choices.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to come back to something that both of you have touched on, namely the issue of disinformation and the fact that we're kind of tiptoeing into really information wars, which are playing out on a national level, but also internationally, as both of you have described. And it's interesting to note that 10 years into the war, many Russians seem to be accepting Vladimir Putin's narrative of what's going on in Ukraine. And so, one question is certainly sort of what your take is on why that's the case, and about the disinformation campaign that is existing in Russia. But the other, and this is perhaps sort of a more broad topic or a broad way to approach it, is what does war propaganda look like in the digital age, and how easy it is to transmit it quite broadly?
Well, I thought it was maybe a Freudian slip that you said in the 10 years of this war, because it's 10 months, sorry, but 10 weeks. I would actually say it's 8 years, because the war really started in 2013. Yeah. So it is much longer than sometimes we acknowledge. I think you're touching on two different points, but I think they're both really important. One is the information environment in Russia itself, which is becoming hermetically sealed. We see the disentanglement of international platforms, not just American platforms, but international platforms. If you look at the list of downloads on app stores right now, you see a spike in downloads for RuTube, which is the YouTube alternative owned by Gazprom, Yappy, which is the TikTok alternative, Fiesta, which is the Instagram alternative. These have all spiked in downloads. They are still compared to pre-war download rates for, the classic platforms, let's say the classic ones that we are aware of, they're still quite low. But it's clear that the capacity to create a hermetically sealed Russian information space is increasing. At the same time, and this is where maybe we have a little bit of good news when we get to see Russian behavior, there has been a massive spike in the download of virtual private networks. VPNs. So whereas prior to the war, the daily download rate of a VPN in Russia was around 14,000 a day, it has gone up to right now 300,000 a day. And at its height, it was at almost 500,000 a day. So the level of downloads of VPNs trying to tunnel into the global internet is quite high. People don't want to give up access to, free open information. So that's a contested space, and it's going to be a contested space for a long time. In Ukraine itself, the information space is quite contested. We have been getting a lot of images out of Ukraine. I think that the work that has happened through, people filming, posting on social media, Bellingcat's work to verify things. Here in Berlin, there's a group called Mnemonic, which looks to do verification of attacks, to authenticate their validity using artificial intelligence. This is quite important. All that said, we're seeing two things. One, in conflict zones, information connectivity infrastructure can easily be damaged. So that's why it is quite important that, for example, we're getting these low Earth orbit satellites from Starlink, definitely something that we should consider as a democratic community doctrinally. How much do we want to think about providing this as a right, the same way we did with shortwave radio in the Cold War with RFERL? Same with VPNs. Right now, VPNs, a lot of people have to pay for them. Should we just subsidize VPNs, especially for conflict zones and authoritarian spaces, so that people have this kind of access? And, what we're seeing right now on the ground is Russia is annexing the information space of occupied territories in Ukraine. So, that's definitely going to be something they're going to want to do, along with the physical, annexation, maybe formally or informally. Cities like Kherson are now being routed through the Russian internet. So what they're trying to do is they consolidate control over spaces to cut off access to the global internet. So that's definitely something that we should be aware of. And the third thing is disinformation globally. And here we need to have a much more sophisticated and nuanced conversation, not just about media literacy, which is extremely important, but also the way that platforms are transparent and provide data access to civil society and academics to see how they are propagating the spread of disinformation and what their actual policies are, transparently defined, that can be subject to scrutiny also from authorities and regulators and civil society of how they're implementing their own terms of service. That has not been the case until we can have that next discussion on the Digital Services Act, but that has not been the case up to now. And that doesn't mean limiting freedom of speech. That means having a space where the rules are clear. And knowing what the rules are. Just like when you go into a mall, you have a no shoes, no shirt, no service kind of policy. Yep. You can have the same thing in an information space, and that can be globally applied. So those are a couple of things that I think that we could discuss in the disinformation governance space. And I think those conversations are starting to happen. But in this acute war, I think we should shift to say, do we believe in the right to information as a fundamental right? And if so, how are we making this a pillar of our foreign policy?
Well, great, Tyson. That was very good passage. You can write a speech next time to some of the ministers, I think. But I actually wanted to respond to your first question, which is most maybe difficult to respond. Why the Russians are falling for this local propaganda and disinformation so easily? And I think in order to understand this phenomenon, we also have to remember that since Putin came to power, he started to build a new Russian identity around the victory in the Second World War, because this was the only unifying principle of all those nations that made up the Soviet Union, or later day Russia. Russia is not a monolithic one country with very homogeneous population. There are many nations in the Russian Federation that do not have always the allegiance to the central power. And there was a need to build this kind of narrative around a major historic event. And well, I grew up in Soviet Union, so I can understand how the people have been always exposed to this war propaganda. Whenever you open TV, there was some sort of tank looking at you. So the war movies were all over the information space, as Russians call it. And Putin just continued the same type of peacetime war propaganda when he took the power in 2000s. And we saw the acts of aggression, well, 2007 Estonia, 2008 Georgia, which was the real war. In Estonia, it was just cyber attack, plus the riots in the streets and hybrid propaganda elements and disinformation elements type of operation. So, and then it was always accompanied with the domestic campaign as well. In Estonian case would be the small nasty country, or in Georgian case it will be something else. In Ukrainian case it's something else. But there is a carefully created narrative that has been repeated in the Russian state media for 20 years against Ukraine and other neighbors. Mm-hmm. And therefore we should not be so surprised that there is such a support right now amongst the Russian population. I think the problem is rather that we did not pay attention before. So,
and it's interesting to hear you talk about sort of this identity issue and the narrative around the victory in World War II, particularly given Putin's statements about May 9th, and that May 9th is just 3 days away. And I think a lot of people are waiting to see what might happen in those next 3 days and what Putin might announce as his victory or partial victory in this conflict in just a few days. So, you know, I mean, in other contexts, we've talked about an escalation of the kinetic conflict, whether chemical weapons might be used, whether tactical nuclear weapons might be used. I guess as we come to a close here, do either of you think that there might be an uptick in the cyber attacks in short order to try to sort of declare victory on May 9th?
You know what I would say, and I'll keep it real short. I actually think it'll be the opposite. I think that Fedorov and the IT army that he has assembled will use this very symbolic moment to point out to the Russians their own weaknesses through DDoS attacks, through other defacing, web defacing, taking down embassy websites, for example, Russian embassy websites abroad, etc. So I think that there will be a lot of activity and a lot of churn, but I think it will be balanced towards Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's of course difficult to understand what is going on in Putin's mind, but possibly he will do some sort of statement, maybe say that yes, they are, you know, successful in Eastern Ukraine, and given the level of propaganda that the domestic public is used there, it really basically doesn't matter what he says. Everything what he says will be then welcomed with continuing applause.
Mm-hmm. Well, Heli and Tyson, I want to thank both of you for this very engaging and very informative conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. I hope that our viewers have as well. And you know, I feel on the one hand that we've covered a lot of different topics, but also that there are a number of topics that I think all of us have identified as areas where further dialogue, further engagement is necessary. And if there are ways in which we can have that dialogue together, I would certainly welcome that, and I think that our members and friends would as well. But for now, let me just thank you both for joining us today. This has been really a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.